Hello, welcome to today's Immigration Tidbit. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, let's talk a little bit about H-1Bs. Okay, I've done a lot of videos on H-1Bs, but one of the cornerstones of the H-1B is that it has to be a specialty occupation. Okay, now you have to ask yourself, what is a specialty occupation, and how do you prove it, and what does immigration look for, and how can you try to minimize the RFE, okay, which is a request for evidence. So one thing people do when they start off with the H-1B is they overly generalize the title. Like they'll say business analyst, marketing analyst, computer specialist, okay? And what that does is that tells immigration that maybe it's not a specialty occupation, because maybe all you're doing is looking to see what might have been proven before was a specialty occupation and then using the same name. They also have what's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, okay? And there they do list descriptions of tons of different jobs. One thing that generates an RFE is if you go into the OOH, I know I'm using lots of initials, the Occupational Outlook Handbook, which is actually online, and you essentially copy word for word the description of the job duties, then it's not going to happen. It's not going to work, okay? They're going to know what you're doing. They're going to know you're just copying to try to make it look like that's the specialty occupation. So what you have to concentrate on is incorporating the OOH. I mean, sure, you can use that as a basis, but then let's say that it's like a paragraph long, okay? So what you do is you look at that paragraph, whatever it says, and then you incorporate the specifics of this job and this company into there so that it becomes the real H-1B position. So let's say, we're talking marketing analyst. So, it lists what a marketing analyst does. And then, of course, what you would do is you would look at the company. What does it need to market? What are you analyzing? Why are you doing it for the various divisions? Which divisions? Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? You make it specific so that it clearly, is what your particular position is. And then same with the title. Instead of just saying, for example, marketing analyst, let's say you're working for a paper distribution company or something, you would say marketing analyst for West Coast distribution of, cardboard products division. Okay, something like that. You see what I'm saying? So you would get more specific like that. Then you, of course, have to look at what's called the SVP, which gives what the normal education is for that type of position, okay? And you have to make it so that the position, that it's normal to have a degree for the position. If the position doesn't normally require a college degree, and I mean a 4-year college degree, then the H-1B is not going to happen. It's not going to work. It won't be approved. So let me give you an example. A lot of people will try to get an H-1B for a nurse, okay? And a lot of nurses have bachelor's degrees. However, bachelor's of nursing, BSN. However, as far as immigration is concerned, as far as the OOH is concerned, one can be a registered nurse without having a degree. It's not required. And so, for the most part, if a nurse tries to apply for an H-1B, it's going to be denied. There are exceptions. Let's say it's a charge nurse of the pediatric cardiology unit, okay? There would be much more easier to prove that that particular person would need to have a degree. But for a typical RN, the answer would be no. So I mean, I could give, simple examples like, could say a cashier, busboy, a cook, things like that. Obviously, you can't do an H-1B for that. There's all kinds of other visas you might be able to do, but not the H-1B. So the way to properly prepare the H-1B is to take the governmental descriptions, to research the minimum requirement for this type of position. So the SVP should probably be about a 7. That would normally be at least a 4-year degree. Meaning that, like just so you know, like SVP2 would be like no experience at all, and like a lawyer or postgraduate type degree would be like at least an 8. Okay. So obviously the higher the number of the SVP, the more education is required. So you might be able to get an H-1B in certain cases that don't require a college degree for the normal position. But if you are classified, for example, as a manager of that division or a director of that division, then you might be able to argue that the degree is required. So when you put it all together, confirm it has the SVP is high enough so that the college degree is normal. Look at the OOH and use it as a base for the description, but then expand upon it and put in the middle of all, in it, the description itself and the specifics of your company, and make the title specific as well. Now, you also, of course, have to look at the case law, and you do have to look at the prior approvals to see if there's any that exist. Because if you can show, for example, I said marketing analyst or computer analyst, that there's case law to show that it's a specialty occupation, it only helps you. You can cite it. They of course have the discretion to deny it still, but at least you say, well, in so-and-so case, similar position was accepted as an H-1B. Now, what you have to be mindful of is look at the dates on when they were accepted, because there's been sometimes where they did accept it, and then cases came out where they didn't accept it. So you have to be careful, because if you cite a case or prior approvals of that position, they'll just send it back and say, well, if you look at so-and-so since, this year, 2 years ago, those have no longer been considered specialty occupation visas. And I know it's unfair that, at one point they approve it and then all of a sudden they send, various memos as to why it's not approvable, and then they don't approve it anymore. So it becomes imperative that you do proper research to make sure that there's some history of approvability of that position and that that hasn't been revoked or rescinded. And not that every position is going to be, have a history. You might make new type positions depending on what you're doing, that there is no history. And then, of course, it's going to be more difficult to argue, but you can argue it. There's no requirement to do an H-1B that there has to be prior approvals of that same position. It just makes your case easier if there are. Okay? So, given all that, if you follow this, the H-1B will be easier to get through. Nothing is easy in immigration, but at least it'll be easier. Okay,